Kouky, welcome to our monthly, mate. There's a lot of stuff going to come out this month, a lot of information come out this month. We'll park that for a moment. We'll come back to that, and I know you're sort of big on talking about those sort of things. The RBA meets now when?
It's on the 7th of May.
7th of May, right. So
that's about a month.
That's the new cadence.
The new timetable every 7 or 8 weeks, yes.
And the reason why that date May is a good date is because, and we'll look at your chart a little bit later, but they're going to get data on unemployment soon, and we're going to get data on inflation later this month. What are the sorts of bits of information we due to get?
They're the two critical ones. We've had the other news that's sort of coming out last night, in fact, on the US inflation rate to sort of give a guide to what's happening in the US economy. And just today, as we're speaking, we've just had the Chinese inflation numbers, which are really low.
Okay, so let's come to the US.
They're important, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Tell me about the US. What happened?
US, inflation's not falling anymore. Inflation started to fall around the end of 2022. The Fed, the US Federal Reserve, their central bank, was hiking interest rates and kept hiking them. And inflation fell and fell and fell until sort of towards the end of last year. And everyone was sort of saying, yep, inflation's on track to get to the 2% target.
Where did it land, though?
It landed a little below 3% at the end of 2023. The last couple of months, including last night's number, it's back up to 3.5%.
So it's kicked up.
So it's kicked up a little bit. Now, a lot of that is things that we're familiar with, oil prices, feeds directly into petrol prices and the like. They've got an issue with rents, a little bit like here, and some of the services costs, so things like insurance and that sort of stuff, were feeding into their inflation rate. So it's not a disaster, but that move to lower inflation has stalled, let's say. And of course, where we were, say, 3-4 months ago, where there were 5 or 6 rate cuts priced into the US, it's now only 2 in 2024.
Okay, can we just dig in a little bit on this? We have an election coming up in the US later this year.
Indeed.
Toward the end of this year. And governments always want to get re-elected. Yeah. And I wonder whether or not there's been a bit of money splashed around in the US, and that some of this inflation generating activity or behaviour from consumers is not so much the consumers, but more the vendors. That vendors are pushing prices up because they feel as though the consumers can afford it, and only in certain segments. So how do you reckon Biden's expenditure process, which is designed to win people over, by the way, how much of an effect do you think that's having on inflation there?
I think that's the telling point. I think you've raised the critical issue on why that inflation rate hasn't continued to fall. Yeah, as I said, inflation in China's falling, in Europe it's falling, in Australia, in New Zealand, it's falling just about everywhere. The odd man out, the odd person out is the US, where inflation's stopped falling. And you think, well, why? Why is it the US and not the rest of the world? And you're quite right. Biden, with his, I can't remember what it's called now, the strangely named inflation-busting stimulus measures, so it's sort of counterintuitive, we called it a strange thing, but he has literally allocated, the government has allocated in the US, well over $1 trillion to build sort of renewable energy things, all worthy objectives, but it's happening when inflation hasn't been beaten yet, when the unemployment rate in the US is still below 4%. It's been below 4% for 3 years now. Wages, they've come off a bit, but they're still higher than in Australia. So that inflation momentum is being sparked a little bit, not by the Fed, because they've hiked. Their cash rate,
Federal Reserve as is.
Federal Reserve, their cash rate's 5.5. It's more than 1 percentage point higher than in Australia, just by the way. But Biden administration is pumping money out the door at a great rate of knots, and that's finding somewhere in the economy, whether it's the people who make solar panels or, dare I say it, the bombs that are going around in the world in the war. Some of those armament companies are doing very well, thank you.
And they employ people.
They employ a lot of people and use a lot of resources, a lot of stuff to, must confess I don't know how you make a bomb, but lots of metal and stuff like that. And they've got to transport it around the place and all stuff. So that effect on the economy, putting aside all the social issues associated with that, just for argument's sake, the economic effect is a big stimulus, cash being pumped into the economy just when inflation should be falling, but it isn't.
So our mate Milton Friedman, said many times, and anyone wants to go and have a go, just YouTube him.
Yep.
Consumers never create inflation or cause inflation. Governments do, because governments spend, put money in the system. So this is an example of fiscal policy sort of working in against monetary policy.
You got it in one. That's the problem. Now, if we just go back to the pandemic, when the wheels were falling off all the economies of the world, fiscal and monetary policy operated in the same direction.
Yep.
Rates were cut, money pumped in, fine, terrific. Yeah, we didn't know where we were during the pandemic. Absolutely appropriate. We've come out of the pandemic, and most countries, and even here, look, I'll give the government a little bit of credit. They've got a budget surplus. Unlike the US. We've had the RBA, as we've discussed many times, hiking interest rates pretty aggressively. And so they're sort of both working. Maybe the government could do a bit more in terms of tightening fiscal policy, but they haven't screwed it up, put it that way. Whereas in the US, we've had the Fed, and that's why the Fed has hiked, the Federal Reserve has hiked more than in Australia. They've hiked 550 basis points. We've only hiked 425. And I think when we sort of distill it into simple terms, there's obviously many complexities. It's probably because fiscal policy, government spending, is a lot more stimulatory in the US than it is in Australia, just for an example.
Because one of the things that has happened, particularly, which I'm pleasantly surprised about, because, we're a Labor country, nearly, other than Tasmania. Like, it's Labor everywhere.
Yep.
Even at state level, someone like Kouky, he's been cutting expenditure.
Yes.
Like stuff that was committed by the previous administration.
Yep.
Daniel Mookie's been out there responsibly saying, no, we're not going to spend that money anymore. We're not extending that rail line or whatever it is to wherever it was originally.
We're going to push it back 5 years when we can afford to do it in 5 years' time.
We can't just keep spending money like drunken sailors.
Correct.
And Dr. Jim, he's doing the same sort of thing.
He is.
Here in Australia.
It depends a little bit on states, but, for example, Victoria, which probably has the weakest budget position of all the states, but even cancelling the Commonwealth Games, remember that kerfuffle 6 months ago? Look, fair enough, because it was going to cost them X billion dollars that they didn't have. And, like the federal government, the states' budgets were all screwed up because of the COVID pandemic. Now they've got to repair them. They've got to use, and they don't have the same level of resources to fix their budget. They basically only collect taxes from
stamp
duty and some gambling taxes and payroll tax. Not much else.
They get allocated GST money.
They do get allocated the GST money, but that's about it. They can't just bump up a whole lot of other new taxes without doing much. So in fact, if you look at the good old GDP, C plus I plus G government, it's actually been relatively weak over the last year or two as the budgets have been repaired, and that's as it should be. And as you say, that's a little tick to the governments. They're doing the right thing on average. Maybe they could be doing more, but they're doing the right thing.
Well, they could be doing less too. So I wonder. The US, the Democrats' playbook for winning or being re-elected in the US right now seems to be spend.
Yep.
Are you worried that our Labor Party to be re-elected in 2025, they're going to borrow from the USA playbook? Because they have done a lot of the USA playbook. Not necessarily in fiscal sense, but generally speaking, a lot of stuff they're talking about, new renewable stuff, there is a playbook there.
Well, that'll be an issue that'll crop up over the course of the next 12 months. We don't have a set date for our election in Australia, but it's probably going to be in the first part of 2025, probably. That's the 3-year anniversary of the last election. So we're basically a year away from our next election. And as you said, people like to have $1 in their pocket. They prefer that than having $1 taken out by the government.
They will blame someone if they don't.
Correct. Well, there's the income tax cuts that are being paid on the 1st of July, which is actually a good thing. It's coming at sort of the right time for many people. They're going to get a little bit of a, $20, $50 a week lower in their tax payments. That's going to help some pay packets. But your concern about will we see a run-up of spending, a run-up of ideas, and just, literally this last few days we've seen the manufactured in Australia strategy from Albanese and, solar panels being made here and these sort of things. Look,
but he's not throwing money at it.
He's throwing a little bit. It's
relatively speaking.
And relative to the size of the budget, $1 billion here is not that big a deal. However, as we said, the election's a year away and a lot can happen between now and then. If I was advising Albo and Jim Chalmers, I'd be saying, keep a pretty tight rein on it because people actually like a prudent government, and you can claim, the Treasurer can sort of say there at election time this time next year, if interest rates are coming down, we did the right thing, we kept a steady hand on the budget and the rates are down, so give us the credit for it. Now, whether that's strictly accurate is a story for another day, but in politics, its perceptions matter as much as reality.